It took Freddie Mercury longer to run a bath than it did to write Queen's first American #1. By his own account, 5 to 10 minutes, sitting in the water in a hotel room in Munich in 1979. Everything Queen had built up to that point, the 6-minute operas, the layered harmonies, the songs that took months to record, and their biggest hit in America came out of a bathtub faster than most people write a birthday card. The band was in Munich because they were recording an entire album there. Queen had booked time at Musicland Studios in the basement of the Arabella House Hotel to work on what would become the game. It was a different city, a different studio, and by design, a slightly different sound than what they had been chasing for most of the decade. Nobody went into those sessions expecting the album's biggest song to arrive fully formed in a hotel bathroom, before anyone had even picked up an instrument that day. To understand why that is strange, you need to understand how Freddie usually worked. He wrote at the piano. Almost everything from Bohemian Rhapsody onward started there, built in careful layers, revised obsessively in the studio. Queen by 1979 had a reputation for exactly that kind of precision. Crazy Little Thing called Love broke every part of that pattern at once. He got out of the bath still working on it, and reached for a guitar instead of the piano. Freddie barely played guitar. He knew a handful of chords, nothing close to Brian May's fluency on the instrument. By his own admission later, he said the limitation helped him. He could not reach for anything complicated, so the song stayed simple by necessity, not by choice. Sometimes not knowing enough about an instrument is the whole reason a song works. This was not the first time a member of Queen had written outside their main instrument either, but it was the most consequential. Brian May wrote at guitar because it was his instrument. Roger Taylor and John Deacon occasionally brought in ideas from bass and drums. Freddie almost never touched guitar in public. For him to reach for one instinctively, mid-idea, straight out of the bath, says something about how urgently the melody had already arrived. He was not choosing an instrument. He was chasing a feeling before it left. What came out was not a Queen song, in the way audiences had come to expect one. It was a tribute. Freddie had grown up loving Elvis Presley, and this was him writing his own version of a rockabilly Elvis single, slapback rhythm, simple chords, a lyric that could have been sung in 1956. He brought it to the band the next day at rehearsal, played it on guitar the way he had written it, and by every account, the room reacted immediately. Brian May did something unusual with it too. Queen's sound, for most of the decade, had been built around May's homemade red special guitar, layered and orchestral. For this song, he set it aside and picked up a Fender Telecaster instead, the guitar of choice for the era Freddie was imitating. It was a small decision that mattered enormously. The song needed to sound like it came from a jukebox in 1956, not a studio in 1979, and the Telecaster is what got it there. The recording itself took almost no time by Queen's standards. Compare it to Bohemian Rhapsody, which had taken weeks of overdubbed vocal harmonies stacked into something that barely resembled a normal rock recording. Crazy Little Thing called Love was closer to how a band in the 50s would have actually made a record. Few takes, minimal layering, a live feel captured quickly. The song that took 10 minutes to write took barely longer than that to make sound effortless. There is a detail in the recording that most listeners never notice, and it is entirely deliberate. The band wanted the track to sound like it had been cut in a single room in the 50s, not assembled piece by piece the way Queen usually worked. So they leaned into a rower mix, less separation between instruments, closer to how a rockabilly single would have actually been captured on the equipment of that era. It is a studio trick built to sound like the absence of studio trickery. Getting a modern band to sound convincingly old-fashioned takes real skill, even when the song underneath it was written in minutes. 1979 was not a comfortable year for a song like this to exist. Disco had dominated for most of the decade, and by this point, a backlash against it was building fast. Punk and new wave were pulling audiences toward something rawer and more stripped down. Neither disco nor punk was really where this song belonged. Crazy Little Thing Called Love did not chase either trend. It reached backward past both of them to rock and roll's original decade. Released as a single in October of 1979, it went into the UK charts and climbed to number 2. 2 weeks at number 2, held off the top by Dr. Hook's When You're in Love with a Beautiful Woman. Close, but not quite the summit at home. That would not be the ceiling. It would turn out to be a warm-up for what happened next on the other side of the Atlantic. In America, it went all the way. Crazy Little Thing Called Love became Queen's first number 1 single on the Billboard Hot 100, arriving there in early 1980. It held the top spot for 4 consecutive weeks. For a band that had spent years building a following in America through relentless touring without quite cracking the very top of the singles chart, this was the one that finally did it. And it did it by sounding like nothing else Queen had put out before. There is something almost unfair about which song did it. Bohemian Rhapsody, Endlessly Ambitious, had not been Queen's American number 1. Somebody to Love, with its cathedral of vocal harmonies, had not done it either. The song that finally cracked the American summit was written in a bathtub in 10 minutes by a man who could barely play the instrument he wrote it on. Craft did not do this one, instinct did. The music video mattered too, and it was shot almost as quickly as the song itself. Filmed in black and white, with Freddie in leather and a look modeled directly on 50s rock and roll performers, it leaned all the way into the homage rather than hiding it. There was no ambiguity about what the song was doing. It announced its influence on camera, the same way it announced it in the arrangement. For a band that had built entire mythologies around some of its earlier videos, this one was almost defiantly simple. 4 men in a room, playing a song about wanting somebody, and it worked exactly as well as the single did. It became, almost immediately, a permanent part of Queen's live shows. Audiences loved playing along with its simplicity. It was short, direct, and easy to sing back at a stadium, in a set that otherwise demanded a lot of concentration from a crowd. It gave people somewhere to exhale between the more demanding songs. By the time Live Aid came around in 1985, it was one of the songs Queen chose to play in their now legendary 20-minute set, alongside Bohemian Rhapsody and We Will Rock You. Think about what that means for the song's staying power. Out of an entire back catalog, in front of the largest television audience most performers will ever have, this was one of the handful of songs the band trusted to hold a stadium's attention. A song written in a bathtub earned a place next to their most ambitious work. Freddie's Elvis fixation did not end with this one song either. He kept a lifelong fascination with Presley, and this track is generally read as the clearest evidence of it inside Queen's own catalog. Not a cover, not a pastiche played for laughs, but a genuine, structurally faithful homage written by someone who had absorbed that sound as a teenager and never stopped hearing it. A boy in a British boarding school, listening to American rock and roll on a crackling radio, eventually wrote his own version of it and put it at the top of the American charts. He never got to meet Elvis Presley. Presley died in 1977, 2 years before this song existed. The tribute arrived after the man it was aimed at was already gone, which is its own quiet, unremarked-upon sadness sitting underneath a song most people think of as pure fun. What makes the story worth telling is not really the chart position. It is the contrast. Here was a band famous for pushing studio technology to its limit, for 6-minute suites that critics said could never work as a single, and their biggest American hit was the least ambitious thing they had recorded in years. Sometimes the thing that connects hardest is not the one you labored over. It is the one that arrived almost finished, fully formed, while you were doing something else entirely. It is worth putting this story next to what came right before it in Queen's history. The years leading into the game had been increasingly ambitious, layered vocal arrangements stacked into towers, guitar orchestras built take by take, entire suites of music inside a single track. It is the sound of a band proving, repeatedly, how much control they had over a recording studio. And then the song that broke through hardest in America was the one where they let go of almost all of it. Not a rejection of that ambition, just proof that the same band could do the opposite just as well, on the same album, within weeks of each other. The game itself became Queen's best-selling studio album in the United States, and Crazy Little Thing Called Love was the song that opened the door for it. Everything that followed on that record, including another song built on a completely different foundation, Another One Bites the Dust, arrived into an American audience that this single had already won over. One 10-minute bathtub idea helped reshape how an entire country heard the rest of the album. That is a strange amount of weight to put on a song about wanting somebody, written half-dressed in a hotel room, by a man who could barely play the instrument he wrote it on. Nobody involved could have predicted that in the moment. That is usually how the biggest turns in a career actually happen.